Welcome to this explainer. Today we're doing something a little bit different. We're going to look past those pristine marble columns, the legendary emperors, and all the shining armor of one of history's most famous empires. Instead, we're diving straight into the hidden and, frankly, absolutely terrifying reality of young male slaves in ancient Rome.
I want you to really think about this for a second. Put yourself in these shoes. Imagine being just 16 years old. You wake up every single morning knowing your life simply does not belong to you. You can't choose where you live, you don't choose who you work for, or even if you get to stay with your own family. Your childhood has basically vanished overnight. Your name, your labor, your physical body, they're entirely controlled by someone else. For countless young men, this wasn't a nightmare, this was their everyday reality.
All right, let's jump into Section 1. Property, not people. The Roman legal reality.
Now, under Roman law, these young men were legally treated as property. I mean, pause and think about what that actually means for a human being. Sold, transferred, punished, forced to labor on demand. Sure, there was no single, uniform experience of Roman slavery because the empire was huge, but this was the terrifying baseline that connected every single one of them. They were, legally speaking, commodities.
And who exactly were they? Well, Roman slavery wasn't based on one specific race or ethnic group like we often see in more modern history. The empire's massive military expansion pulled in people from all over. We're talking Gauls, Greeks, Thracians, Britons, North Africans, folks from the Balkans and Asia Minor. The system just vacuumed massive numbers of captives right into the slave market through warfare. And, completely tragically, this status was inherited. A child born to an enslaved mother was instantly enslaved under Roman law. So this nightmare literally just rolled over from one generation to the next.
Moving right along to Section 2, Destinies Decided at Market, the Roman Slave Trade.
Okay, imagine standing in the middle of a Roman marketplace. It is a terrifying crossroads. The whole process was incredibly clinical. Potential buyers would come up and essentially examine these young men based on age, health, specific skills like literacy or accounting, and even just physical appearance. One buyer might be looking for a nice household servant, while the next guy needs brutal agricultural labor. A young man's ultimate destination was decided right there on the spot, completely transforming his entire life in an instant.
And a purchase here dictated vastly different physical realities. One young guy might be whisked away to some wealthy urban household where he's serving meals, cleaning, maybe working in the kitchens or carrying messages. But another guy, he might be sent straight to the mining operations. We're talking complete darkness, extreme exhaustion, terrible air, and constant deadly danger, with almost zero chance of escape. So that one-word slave actually hid a massive difference in day-to-day physical survival.
But here's the absolute kicker. Comfort did not mean freedom. Even the most privileged urban household slave, maybe someone highly trained in medicine or managing big business affairs, still lived under the constant, looming threat of punishment. Their entire position in life depended 100% on the household that owned them. Even with a nice roof over their head, they were totally dependent.
Let's get into Section 3, the arena and resistance, fighting the system.
We really need to scrap that Hollywood image of the glorious gladiator, the cheering crowds and the noble fight for glory. As one historian put it so perfectly, his body became an economic investment. A young enslaved man could be forced into a gladiatorial training school simply because his owner wanted a solid return on investment. They trained him to survive and perform for money. The arena essentially turned human violence into casual entertainment, trapping young men in a system that literally commodified their physical survival.
But listen, these young men were not just passive victims. Not at all. They actively resisted their enslavement every single day. Some did it in subtle ways, right? Slowing down their work, committing minor theft, or constantly carefully negotiating for slightly better treatment and protection for their family members. Others, they took massive, life-threatening risks through escape attempts, outright sabotage, or even full-scale organized rebellion.
And all that resistance eventually culminated in the famous Spartacus revolt. Starting around 73 BCE, Spartacus and thousands of others launched a massive armed rebellion. And they actually successfully fought Roman forces for years. It's incredible. But the final battles did ultimately lead to their defeat. In the aftermath, thousands of captured rebels were crucified all along the Appian Way. The message from Rome was loud, clear, and unmistakable. They would defend the institution of slavery with overwhelming, crushing violence.
Which brings us to a really tough part of the story. Section 4, families torn apart. No legal protections.
You could be sold. Just like that. Partners separated. Parents, children, siblings, gone. Enslaved people formed deep, meaningful relationships and communities just like anyone else. But unlike free Roman citizens, they had absolutely zero legal protections for their families. For a young boy, this meant living with the constant, terrifying threat of growing up without the people he was born with. Even if he managed to form a family later in his life, that entire family could be ripped apart in an instant just because an owner made a business decision.
Now, there was this concept called manumission. This was the process where an owner could eventually grant someone their freedom. If you were freed, you could finally conduct business, own property, and form a legally recognized family. But we have to be clear, this process was incredibly complex, deeply unequal, and absolutely not guaranteed. And even if a young man did somehow achieve his freedom, the heavy social stigma of having once been enslaved, that was never completely erased from his record.
Let's look at the big picture now in Section 5, Rome's magnificent contradiction, glory built on slavery.
This right here is the core tension of ancient history. On one hand, you have the absolute magnificence of Rome. Monumental buildings, those incredible expansive roads, the aqueducts, luxury villas, and these highly elevated philosophical ideas of citizenship and law. But the grim reality? That entire economy was powered by millions of human beings who were completely denied their most basic freedoms. The prosperity of this legendary civilization stood directly on the backs of people whose labor and lives were totally controlled by others.
So how do we even know all this? Well, the famous emperors and the wealthy free citizens, they're the ones who wrote the history books. The voices of the enslaved are much, much harder to find. We basically have to piece their lives together from surviving fragments. We look at legal documents, ancient inscriptions, a few personal letters, archaeological discoveries, and yes, even city graffiti. We are essentially reconstructing an entire world from incomplete evidence, trying to uncover the sons, brothers, workers, and friends who are hidden in the shadows of history.
Which leaves us with this final thought for today's explainer. In a civilization famous for its incredible laws and its monumental achievements, what if your greatest dream wasn't wealth, or power, or glory? What if your biggest dream was simply to belong to yourself, to decide where you go, who you live with, and what your future will be? That incredibly basic freedom was something countless young men in Rome were never, ever allowed to have. It certainly changes how you look at those ancient ruins, doesn't it?